Now let's talk about the material options that we very briefly looked at on these circles. All we did was change the cast shadows to on, but we have a lot of other things that we can control here. Let's turn off the parallel light and the spotlight so we're left with just this point light, and I'm going to make it a little bit more intense. So I'll press T to bring up the intensity and just brighten it up a little bit. Okay, so I'll close that up and let's go through these material options. Obviously we have cast shadows, which turns shadows on, but there's actually a third option if I click one more time, which is cast shadows only. And you can see right here, my circle actually disappeared, but it's still casting a shadow. And that's actually a really useful thing if that's something you need to do. If you just need to cast a shadow on something, but you don't want to see the source of that shadow. So be aware of that setting. I'll leave that set to on. And actually, to make this even easier to see, I'm going to link all of the material options for all of these circles to these ones right here. So I'm going to just select it, come up to Edit, Copy with Property Links, and then paste on all of the remaining circles. And that way, as I adjust these settings, all of these other ones are now linked up with expressions, so they're all going to update at the same time too. At least for the properties that I can link with expressions. The ones where I just have a switch and not actual keyframe properties, those aren't going to be linked. But that's okay. The next option is light transmission. If I turn this from 0% to 100%, take a look at this overhead view. These shadows are now the color of the objects that are casting the shadows. Let me turn that back down to 0 and you can see exactly what's happening. If I turn that up, they become more blue. And if I were to change these to a different color, say yellow, then that light transmission is going to mix with the surface it's touching, which is the blue floor, and it's mixing, it's becoming kind of this green color. So whatever you have this set to, if you have light transmission turned on, you can think of it more like a semi-transparent object, or maybe stained glass, colored glass that the light is shining through and being tinted by. Okay, let's undo to get back to where we didn't have any of that light transmission. And then we have accept shadows. That's turned on, but we can also set that to accept shadows only. And then it's basically going to act as a shadow catcher. And this would be something that would be useful for if you were trying to track graphics into actual shot footage and you needed to make artificial shadows on the ground. Obviously, you don't want to see that fake ground layer in After Effects. You just want to see the shadows that are resulting on top of it and composite them onto the footage. So that's the scenario where I'd want to use the Accept Shadows Only feature. You can also turn Accept Shadows off if you don't want them getting hit by the shadows in your scene. Next we have Accept Lights, which is defaulted to on, but you can also turn that off so that this layer is not affected by the lights in your scene at all. You can change the color. It's always going to be that flat vector looking shape no matter what. But as soon as you turn Accept Lights back on, then it is affected by those lights. Let's get back to our original color and make sure Accept Lights is still on. And these next 5 properties are basically how your objects are going to accept lights and interact with them. This can get pretty confusing, but we'll just walk through them one at a time and kind of talk about them. So first of all, we have ambient. This property basically only interacts with ambient lights. So if I turn ambient all the way down to 0, remember, all of these circles are linked to each other, so let me just go back to one view and fit this to my view. All of these are tied together with expressions, so as I change these material properties, all of the circles are going to update at the same time. So with ambient all the way off, our ambient light isn't affecting them anymore. What it is affecting is the background and the floor layers because I'm not modifying those material properties. But as I turn this on and off, you'll notice these circles are not changing at all. So that is what the ambient material option controls. How much influence the ambience light have over those individual layers. Next up is diffuse, and this is basically how much of the original color of that layer is overriding the rest of the lights. So if I turn it all the way down, the original color of the layer isn't really influencing how they are being shaded by the lights. But if I turn it up, then we're going to get a lot more influence from that color, and it's going to be a lot brighter because it's combined with this ambient light. So if you turn your diffuse up a lot, you might want to turn your ambient light down a bit. And now you can see that there's a lot more harsh shading coming from the light on some of these objects that are closer to it. Let me turn that back down to 50 and turn ambient back up to 100. Next we have specular intensity and specular shininess. If I modify this, you can kind of see that this is basically like the highlight of your material. So if you want your object to look shiny and reflective, like it's really reflecting a lot of light, you're probably going to want to turn your specular intensity up quite a bit. If you don't want any of that reflection, if you want it to be something that's a lot duller of a material that doesn't reflect light all that much, then you're probably going to turn your specular intensity down quite a bit. But let's say that we do want that specular intensity. We want that turned all the way up. Well, then we also have the ability to control the specular shininess. If I turn this up a lot, it looks like the shininess went away, and that's actually because this value is shaping the way that that specularity is appearing on these layers. So let's go to our two views so we can see where the light is in relationship to our objects. And if I move this nice and close to the front one right here, and then drop it down, there we go. It took a little bit of time to render, but now it's right in front of that circle. We can see the specularity and the specular shininess a lot clearer. Let me back the light up just a little bit in Z-space. Okay, and now let's turn that shininess all the way down. And you see that the entire object is reflecting that specular. That specular intensity is pretty much uniformly covering the entire object. But if I turn this up to, say, 50 or around there, then that specular has a fall off, just like our light source had a fall off. So it's bringing that in a lot tighter. And if I turn it up a lot further, that specular hit is going to be even tighter and tighter on that circle. So it's just going to shape the way that that specularity looks on your object. Finally, we have this option called metal. To visualize this a little bit more, I'm going to just change all of these to a different color. Let's say something like this green color. And let's turn this metal value all the way down. You can see that that's really just affecting the specularity of this circle. I'll move it right over in front of this light so we can see it clearer again. And let's turn that metal all the way back up. Okay, so there's a lot more fall off between the brightest and darkest parts of that specularity. And if I turn metal all the way down, there's now a lot less. So it's just another way to shape that specularity on your layer. But that's it. That's the last material option using the standard After Effects 3D renderer. And these material options are uniform across all 3D layers. There are no different options based on the type of 3D layer, kind of like there are different options for different types of 3D lights. Where things get a lot more complicated is this section right here, Geometry Options. But that only shows up if we are using the Cinema 4D renderer, not the classic 3D renderer. We're going to touch on that further on in the class because there are very few scenarios where I would ever go into the Cinema 4D renderer within After Effects. So don't even worry about that right now. But hopefully now you have a good understanding of how material options work inside of After Effects.